Welcome to Brown Bag History for June 1st, 2022. We're talking about royal visits today. And as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snacks territory. And we acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So talking about royal visits today, and I could lie to you and tell you that I knew that tomorrow is when the platinum celebrations for Queen Elizabeth II are starting, and in honor of her 70th year as Queen. But it's actually absolute coincidence. I planned my schedule last fall and wasn't even aware of the Jubilee. But it just so happens that tomorrow is the beginning of the Jubilee celebrations. So I say that I run the museum on the serendipity method, and that seems to be part of it. So we're going to go way back. The first what would be considered a royal visit happened in 1901. This is kind of how Revelstoke would have looked at the time. It was the visit of their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall. And he was at the time, he was the son of the ruling monarch, Edward the Seventh, who was ascended the throne after the death of his mother, Queen Victoria. And he ruled until his death in 1910, at which time George, the Duke of Cornwall and York, ascended the throne as George V. But they were doing, this was probably sort of the first major world tour of any sort of close royal people. They toured the British Empire, including Australia, where they opened the first session of the Australian Parliament upon the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia. And they also went to New Zealand and to Canada. And in 1901, they traveled across Canada on the railway, accompanied by Lord and Lady Minto, who were the Governor General and his wife, and the Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and his wife, Lady Laurier. So in October of 1901, they came through Revelstoke, and the royal party didn't get off of the train, but Lady Minto came off, and she laid the cornerstone of the first Queen Victoria Hospital, which was where Save On Foods is now. And it was a building that was later moved over to become the first Legion building. But the town was all lit up. It said W. Cowan, who had the telephone service in town and one of the big hotels, had put up arc lights with the word welcome arranged in electric lights on the arch. It was very prettily decorated with branches and flags. And then they had decorated the station and the platform. And they said that the town was decorated so that every building on which their eyes were likely to fall would be decorated. So they made sure that it was a lot of bunting and flags. So after Lady Minto laid the cornerstone of the hospital, they adjourned to the CPR station where the royal train was waiting. It said the platform was so densely crowded that Captain Taylor and the Guard of Honor, headed by the band, had some difficulty in getting through to the station on the east end. The Duke could be seen quite plainly writing at a desk and smoking a cigar. After a short time, the Duchess appeared, speaking to him. And just as the train was about to pull out, the royal pair stepped out on the rear end of their car and graciously acknowledged a roar of cheering, which, led by the city clerk, arose first for the Duke and then for the Duchess of York. The band struck up God Save the King, the guard presented arms, and the train carried away the royal pair into the evening twilight. It was a tired crowd which wended its way home to supper, but a contented one. And the tour continued on to Vancouver, where they had a bigger celebration. That was sort of the seat of the major events with the Duke and Duchess. And Revelstoke provided an arch for part of the parade route. I guess some of the communities in the interior and other groups had arches there. And you can see this is in downtown Vancouver, and there's a big arch over the street there. It was representing Revelstoke for the royal tour. So the arch featured a map of the mining districts on one side and oil paintings of camping scenes on the other. It had 2 Union Jacks, oars from Revelstoke sitting at the base, and 3 caribou heads. And they also had men dressed up in mining gear at either side, along with the mayor of Revelstoke at the time. So that was Revelstoke's contribution to the celebrations in Vancouver. The next royal visit didn't happen until 1916. And of course, this was during the First World War. And His Royal Highness, the Duke of Connaught and the Duchess of Connaught and their daughter, Princess Patricia, came. Arthur was one of the sons of Queen Victoria. And at this time, he was Governor General of Canada. So they, at this time, they were starting to build the highway, the mountain road up Mount Revelstoke. They'd actually started back in 1912, and progress was rather slow, but they were continuing their work. And whenever they had a dignitary in town, they'd drive them up to the end of the road at that time and have them plant a post. So this was the July 28th, 1916 visit. And it said, the newspaper said, the royal party make the ascent of Mount Revelstoke in autos and proclaim Revelstoke's auto road and scenery finest on the continent. The Duke of Connaught had requested that there be no official welcome or elaborate entertainment, seeing that this was during the war. Wanted to keep things low key. Said, well, respecting their desire that no formal ceremonials would mark their reception, Revelstoke nonetheless accorded to their Royal Highnesses, the Governor General and party, a wholehearted welcome. They said the vice-regal train was in charge of Mr. W.R. Baker and consisted of 9 cars and arrived precisely at 2:15 p.m. They had bouquets given to the visitors. So the Duchess's bouquet included purple heather from Mount Revelstoke. And the trip up the auto road began just 5 minutes after the arrival of the train. They had 6 cars taking the visitors up the road, with 2 auxiliary cars following behind in case of breakdown, which was quite likely. The drivers were local people: A.E. Kincaid, Dan Leary, Walter Buse, who's the druggist, Lenhausen, Frank McCarty, who's the first mayor, and Dr. W.H. Sutherland. And then they also had with them a detective attached to the Duke of Connaught, as well as police chiefs from Revelstoke and Golden, 2 aides-de-camps and a military secretary, the local CPR superintendent, ladies in waiting to the Duchess and the Princess, Mayor Hector McKinnon, Mrs. Thomas Kilpatrick, who was president of the Red Cross Society, and Mrs. Corsier, who was president of the Women's Canadian Club, and also the acting parks superintendent and some other CPR officials and a few of the local businessmen. So they had profusely decorated Mackenzie Avenue and First Street with flags and bunting for the cars to pass by. So the road was patrolled by the high school cadets. So the 11 miles of completed road, not the road up the 11 miles of the mountain road, was traversed in about 1 hour, 15 minutes. Here the party alighted and made a short stay, mixing freely, there being an entire lack of reserve noticeable. Many pictures were taken, and His Royal Highness planted a post, which now bears in gilded letters the inscription, "This post, placed by His Royal Highness the Duke of Connaught, July 28th, 1916, 3,921 feet. And Mrs. Kilpatrick, who's the president of the Red Cross, presented the Duchess with a book of pressed flowers. And they said that some of the men who were on the road crew at the old internment camp, they'd placed along a portion of the road a number of small fir trees and a beautifully arranged arch decorated with flags. The cook and his assistants had prepared a well-set table for tea. The road crew had collected a bouquet of wildflowers in the park, and they presented those to the Duchess at her request. The Board of Trade presented His Highness the Duke with a book of local photographs collected by Walter Buse and Len Housen. And they said that the CPR's civil engineer, Mr. McQuarrie, very kindly inscribed the presentation leaf and added to the value of the book by depicting a mosquito scene. I'd love to see that. Along with the book was a letter written to His Royal Highness on behalf of the Board of Trade on the history of the city. On the way back to the station, the cars passed the ranches of Job Maley and H. Colbeck, where the royal visitors were presented with boxes of cherries. And back at the station, they reviewed the high school cadets. And then Jimmy Sampson, on behalf of the Boy Scouts, presented His Royal Highness with a basket of British Columbia mountain trout, fresh from the streams of Revelstoke. The Duke expressed his thanks for them and asked a young fisherman some questions about fishing in the locality. They left the city at about 4:50 p.m. So that was, this was the first of the visits that earned the road to the summit, the Royal Road. The second visit was 2 years later by the son of the Duke of Connaught, Prince Arthur of Connaught. He visited on July 30th, 1918. And the newspaper said they arrived here at 1:30 and were met by Mayor McKinnon. So Mayor McKinnon had been mayor for the 1916 visit and was still mayor for the 1918 visit. And again, they had 6 decorated cars driving the visitors up. It said promptly on the hour appointed, the party arrived at the end of the motor road where the ceremony of placing the post was conducted, His Royal Highness officiating, and remarking that the post was nearly 1,300 feet higher than that of his father 2 years ago, which was at a height of 3,921 feet. The post read, "This post was placed by HRH Prince Arthur of Connaught, July 30th, 1918, 5,200 feet. On the journey down, they stopped at Bridge Creek for tea, which was served by several members of the Red Cross Society and the Women's Canadian Club. And then they left the mountain, took a quick trip up the road to the Columbia River Canyon, just below where the Revelstoke Dam is now, and arrived back at the station in time for his 6 p.m. departure. And he was given a box of ripe raspberries from the Women's Canadian Club and a bouquet of delphinium and other bouquets from local groups. So after the war, there was a visit in September 19th, 1919 by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VIII, who abdicated shortly thereafter. But this was his first visit to Revelstoke. So there were immense crowds at both the CPR station and the courthouse. He was driven immediately to the courthouse to unveil the plaque honoring the 100 or so men from Revelstoke and district who died during the war. And that plaque is still on the front of the courthouse, even though they later built the cenotaph in 1923. They left the original plaque. And there's a few errors in the names, but because of the history of it being unveiled by the prince, nobody wanted to remove that plaque. The welcome address was read by Mayor McKinnon, who you can see on the left there. And so this is Mayor McKinnon's third royal visit. He said, "We are proud to be the first city in this outpost province of the empire to welcome you and recall with joy the similar privilege and pleasure we enjoyed in greeting your royal father when as Duke of York, he visited the province in 1901. Said, we feel all the greater pride in presenting our loyal greetings to you because of our knowledge of your personal war record. We have those among us recently returned from Flanders Fields and other theaters of the just concluded bloody battle for liberty and righteousness, who speak praisefully of your devotion to duty and consistent courage throughout that awful period. And the prince replied and said, "My thanks for the kind references made to my war services. What little I was able to do during the last 4 years is no more worthy of commendation than the part played by your returned men who came thousands of miles to fight and to risk their all in the common cause. I am delighted to see them here today to renew, if only for a few minutes, the ties of comradeship first formed in France." The returned soldiers were inspected by the prince. There were about 100 of them there, led by Dr. J.H. Hamilton, who had served with the Medical Corps with the 54th Kootenay Battalion. And as I said, the plaque was arranged for and paid for by the Women's Canadian Club. After the unveiling, the prince was driven up Mount Revelstoke, 15 miles up, which was the end of the road at that point. It said the trip was covered in remarkably good time by the 14 cars. His Royal Highness mentioned the wonderful scenery to be had from the 5,000-foot elevation, and readily understood how the Duke of Connaught could express himself as being enraptured with the surroundings in the Dominion Park. And he was pleased with the site set for the bronze tablet, which was less than 50 yards where Prince Arthur of Connaught had planted his post in 1918. The inscription on the tablet read, "Dominion of Canada, Revelstoke Park, dedicated September 19th, 1919, by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, for the benefit, advantage, and enjoyment of the people of Canada." And afterwards, a luncheon was served by 4 ladies of the Women's Canadian Club, Mrs. Hume, Mrs. Robbins, Mrs. Skeen, and Mrs. Holton. Shortly, it said, the newspaper account said, shortly after 6 o'clock, the return trip was made down the mountain, the prince deciding he would make the trip on foot, and accompanied by his chief of staff, Sir Lionel Halsey, and a detective, made the 6-mile trip down the mountain trail in a little better than an hour. Before getting aboard the train preparatory to leaving, His Royal Highness decided he would like to see a moving picture show. And although it was only 7:10 p.m., Manager Morris was prevailed upon to start the show ahead of time, much to the prince's delight. The girl in the ticket booth was Miss Cassie McKinnon, and the prince paid for the movie with a 2-bit coin, and she later substituted it for one of her own and took the one that the prince gave her and put a little had a little hole through it and wore it as a brooch. It said there were about 1,500 people at the depot to say goodbye, singing "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." The royal train was accompanied over the division from Field to Kamloops by Superintendent T.C. McNabb and CPR officials. At the suggestion of the prince, the school children were to be given a public holiday on Friday, October 10th, which they certainly appreciated. The theater that he went to was the Rex Theater, which is where Hong Kong Restaurant is now. And for years afterwards, they patronized by the Prince of Wales. So they got a lot of mileage out of that visit to the theater. So the Prince of Wales returned in 1927, on August 17th, for the opening of the Mount Revelstoke Highway, which was finally completed, and it was 20 miles long. It had been about 15 years in construction. This was the archway to the park, but they had especially decorated it for the opening ceremony. And you can see there's a little dais to the side there, steps and a little platform. And there's a floral emblem in the front, which is made out of flowers. It's the prince's emblem and his motto, Ich dien. He was accompanied by his brother, Prince George, and I erroneously thought that this was Prince George who became George VI. But in the odd way that the royals have of naming, George VI was, I believe, Albert and a bunch of other names. And Prince George was another brother, a younger brother. But it said before the opening, Prince Edward and Prince George inspected a lineup of over 60 returned soldiers. Both princes shook hands with the veterans, asking each the name of his wartime unit. Prince George, due to an injury to his right hand, occasioned by too much handshaking in the East, used his left hand when gripping the hands of the returned men. They said there were about 1,000 people in attendance at the ceremony. Mayor McKinnon asked the Prince of Wales to officially open the national park. And the Prince said, "If I remember rightly, my visit was marked on that occasion by an informal descent to your mountain and an equally informal visit to your movie hall." There were unrestrained cheers when the Prince cut the ribbon and martial airs by the Revelstoke Band. The May Queen that year, Miss Merle Barton, and Flower Girls, Miss McCarty and Miss Doreen Monroe, presented the princes with bouquets. This was a little cairn that was placed at the summit of the road, but and I've seen some reports saying that the Prince of Wales and Prince George went to the top of the mountain on that visit, but they didn't. This was a really short visit. They just took them for the opening and then they returned them to their train. So the really big visit happened on May 28th, 1939, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited. Now this is Queen Elizabeth who became Queen Mother, the wife of King George VI. And this was really significant. This was just a few months before World War II was declared, and people were concerned about the onset of a potential war. And this was really a way to sort of encourage people, raise morale, and just sort of increase people's devotion to the British Empire. So it was quite strategic, but it meant a lot to people then. The world was just sort of coming out of a depression, the global depression, and so it was very significant. There were over 9,000 people present, and that was more than double the population at the time. So was people coming here from all through the Okanagan and from the Kootenays, coming up on the steamboats and on the railway up here. The planning had been in place for weeks. We actually have a copy of an information sheet for visitors and also an invitation or an information sheet for the police for all the protocols that they were looking after. The visitor sheet included information on parking, hotels and restaurants, list of homes that would be available for billets, seating for aged people. And the aged people had to apply in writing to City Hall to get to one of these special seats. When the newspaper said, and all the people shouted, "God save the King." And it didn't matter that the people were drenched to the skin after several hours in an unprecedented downpour of rain. It was merely incidental that new hats and other finery were ruined, and it made no difference to the playing of the national anthem that the 50-odd bandsmen sputtered water after every note. Indeed, what did it matter? The King and Queen had come. Before coming to Revelstoke, they actually made a brief stop at Glacier. These are photographs from the family album of a family that lived at Glacier at the time. And you can see the Queen with her beautiful fur stole. And there they are again. They briefly stopped out at Glacier and were presented with flowers by the residents there, and of course admired the scenery. So these are some of the very wet people waiting for the arrival of the King and Queen. The newspaper article said that the Queen actually had tears at the thought of all of the old people and children standing waiting for out in the rain waiting for them for hours, because people had been there for hours waiting. And that really moved her, that people had been waiting that long. One of the really big deals about the royal visits were the train crews. It was a real honor to be chosen for the crew for the royal trains. The main engine, 2850, was the engineer was O.E. Johnson, and the fireman was Fred Woodland. And on engine 5902, it was engineer Charles Haggett and fireman O'Connor. And the assisting engine 5919 was engineer John Rutherford, with fireman Stan Lee and master mechanic Webster, or Warner. I left his name out of my notes here. The 5919 was at the head of the three engines to assist the royal train up the grade from Beavermouth to the summit of Rogers Pass. A copy of the Nelson News from June 5th, 1939 said the triple header, as railroaders call it here, made more than a slight impression on the royal couple. And when W.M. Neal, Vice President of the Canadian Pacific's Western Line, asked their Majesties if they would like to ride the cab of the leading engine, they accepted with alacrity. The Queen, always with an ear bent for an accent betraying an origin not far removed from oatcakes and heather, soon detected engineer Rutherford's Scottish birth. And he told her that he had been a fireman with the Caledonian Railway out of Edinburgh until 1903, when he left to join the CPR. John or Jock Rutherford was the father of Ruby Nobbs. And Ruby told me that Mr. Rutherford had asked his wife to make sure that he had his best clean uniform available, but he wouldn't tell anybody why. And afterwards, they realized why he wanted to look his best that day. And from Revelstoke to Kamloops, there was W.H. Govett and F. Barrow. And on the assisting engine was George Williamson, who was a real pioneer engineer in this area, and fireman George Deptford, who's the Deptford family that had been in Revelstoke for years. Just a few other photographs of the visit. They got off the train and spent some time greeting people. You can see some of the different groups that were there in 1939. They were greeted by Mayor Walter Hardman and Mrs. Hardman. This is Mrs. Hardman next to the Queen. She was quite a tall woman. Beautiful and well dressed. Yes. Yeah. And there they were at the departure of the train. So after the royal visit, the royal coat of arms from the decorated steam locomotive, which it was known as the Royal Hudson, and it had two large cast aluminum alloy plaques with the royal coat of arms on each side of the coal tender. One of the plaques was presented to Revelstoke Division for display in their garden. And by 1972, it was looking rather worn. So it was repainted by local artist David Williams. And he actually wrote to the Queen's office about the correct coloration. And he received a reply from Her Majesty's Lord Chamberlain, along with a color print of the correct design, which was as used by King George VI. And the plaque was completed and was put back on display. Not sure if, is that one in the Railway Museum?
Yeah, it's not in the museum. It's just been donated to some CPR other than the scrap pile.
Okay, so that's been recently donated to the Railway Museum. And I was going to mention that the seat that the Queen sat on in the cab of, because they rode on the cab between Beavermouth and Stony Creek, and the seat that she sat on was later given to Jock Rutherford, and then Ruby donated that to the Railway Museum. And I believe it's just in storage at the moment. They just removed it from display for a short period. It's on display now? Okay. So the next big visit was in 1951 when Princess Elizabeth, as she was then, and the Duke of Edinburgh visited, and it was October 19th, 1951, and the newspaper said, only twice in the last 50 years has snow covered the ground prior to October 25th. And that we were told was in 1926. The second time was last Friday, when 4 inches of snow covered the ground, and more was in the process of coming down when the royal train bearing Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh pulled into the station promptly at 11:40 a.m. And again, Mayor Hardman was there and greeted the royal visitors. It said the princess rounded the corner at the kiosk and immediately spotted the tiny tots from the United Church kindergarten, wildly waving an enthusiastic welcome with flags. Her Royal Highness was much impressed and asked Mrs. Wilfred Nobbs all about the group. That was Ruby. Dressed in the mink fur coat presented to her at Ottawa by the Dominion of Canada and wearing black rubber boots, she stopped to chat with representatives of the Guides, Scouts, and other groups. She spoke to Marion Sinfield of the Girl Guides, and Reverend Harry S. MacDonald, and Bernard Nelson and J.H. Burton of the Scout Troops, and along with a few others. In that year, the Royal Train crew consisted of conductor H.G. McNabb and trainman R. Williams and B.O. Anderson. And then they had different crews for different legs of the journey. But from the Revelstoke to Kamloops trip, the engineer was George Deptford, who had been one of the crew members on the 1939 crew as well. And there she is, bravely walking through the snow with Mayor Walter Hardman. Walter Hardman was mayor for almost 25 years, so he managed to get in a few royal visits. And Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne on February 6, 1952, on the death of her father, George VI, and her coronation took place on June 2nd, 1953. And her sister, Princess Margaret, toured Canada and British Columbia in 1958 as part of the centennial, British Columbia centennial of the creation of British Columbia as a crown colony in 1858. She had had a longer visit in Kelowna, but had a brief stop on the train in Revelstoke on her way through east. The special train consisted of some of CPR's new equipment, including a deluxe diner Princess, a chateau sleeper, a manor sleeper, and a scenic dome coach. The private cars Strathcona and Mount Stephen will be on the train for the private use of the royal party. And this photograph actually was, we got a group of slides in recently, and most of them were just scenic shots and really of no value to us. But there were two photographs that I was pretty sure were of the visit of Princess Margaret, but I think these were taken at Golden rather than at Revelstoke. But it's the same dress she's wearing in this picture with Mayor Walter Hardman at Revelstoke. So the train arrived promptly at 2:20 p.m. All approaches to the station were lined with people. Her Royal Highness was presented to Mayor Walter Hardman by Lieutenant Governor Frank Ross. The party moved down the platform out onto the street. Senior citizens were provided space against the station and had a good view of the princess. And then, of course, they had all the children lined up for inspection: the Rocky Mountain Rangers, the Canadian Legion, the Brownies, Scouts, Girl Guides, Cubs, and the staff from Queen Victoria Hospital. So the princess chatted briefly with Mrs. Helen West about the Girl Guides and with Scout Peter Jones, and also spoke to Miss Isabel Otway, registered nurse, superintendent of nurses at the hospital. She had just a 10-minute walk and then again had a brief platform stop at Golden. So this was the second visit of Queen Elizabeth, but her first as queen. This was July 10th, 1959. And the man with his back to us is Justice Minister E. Davy Fulton of Kamloops, who accompanied Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip on their visit to Revelstoke last Friday. And according to the newspaper, it said he described the weather perfectly when he said, "This is Queen's weather, and we hope both stay with us for a long time." That there were more than 5,000 people gathered at the station and along the parade route. The parade was led by the Rocky Mountain Ranger Band of Kamloops, the militia, members of the Legion Auxiliary, Scouts, Cubs, Girl Guides, and Brownies. The Queen was and Prince Philip were presented to Mayor Walter Hardman and Mrs. Hardman, and B.R. Stiles, Bud Stiles, that's him here, and his wife, Mrs. Stiles. He was the superintendent of Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks. And it was noted that Mayor Hardman was the only mayor in BC and possibly even in Canada to have officially greeted two reigning monarchs. It was mentioned that 8-year-old Brownie Diana Durand presented the Queen with a large bouquet of flowers. Before coming to the dais, they walked along the platform, and there's Mrs. Hardman on that end with the hat, and Mrs. Stiles, Walter Hardman, Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth, and E. Davy Fulton. And so they stopped frequently to chat with once they got to where there were crowds of people. These photographs actually came from the family of Bud Stiles. Before that, we didn't have any photographs of just one photograph of the 1959 visit. So we're quite delighted to get these. And then came up to the little dais at the front. You can see the crowds of people standing. This is at the east side of the station. So they stopped frequently to chat. They talked with Santo Fioco, who was the Legion president, and Ben Nelson, the past president. And they chatted with William Durand, who was a veteran of both the Boer War and World War I. And they talked to Mrs. Anna Huckle, the Cub leader. And the prince asked Mrs. Huckle if the cubs were all hers or were they borrowed for the occasion. Mrs. Huckle told him that they were 2 packs. And the prince asked, "What do you do when you are not looking after boys?" "I am a housewife," she replied. "Ah," replied the Duke, "that's the best job of all." And she also spoke with Bernard Nelson, who was one of the scoutmasters, and some of the scouts, as Yoshi Hashimoto and Len Brown, Ron May, Olnus Wiedemann, and we don't know the last scout there. So if anybody recognizes them, we'd love to get that name as well. After their inspection, the King and Queen entered a Cadillac, which had been flown from Chicago to Penticton and then driven up here. The parade proceeded along Mackenzie Avenue to First and along to Pearson, and then to Mount Revelstoke National Park. They went as far as the first lookout, where they ascended a platform which had been specially built for the occasion, and spent 20 minutes enjoying the view. The car then returned to the station, and the train pulled out promptly at 8 o'clock. The newspaper of July 30th, 1959 says, "An autographed photograph of the Queen and Prince Philip has been received by Mayor Hardman from the Queen's private secretary. This has been framed and hung in the City Hall." Mr. Ford, in his letter to the mayor, says, "The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh have signed a portrait of themselves for the City Hall, Revelstoke, to commemorate the very pleasant visit which they paid to your city." There's a few pictures taken just before they headed out. So as I mentioned, this weekend is the the big platinum celebration in England, and they're having a big platinum party at the Palace on Saturday evening. And I believe all of the events are going to be carried by CBC television. So if you go on CBC, you can find the schedule for events. There's 4 days of events, and I believe they're all going to be filmed and shown on CBC. So this big concert is including Queen with Adam Lambert and Lord Andrew Lloyd Webber, Sir Elton John, Sir Rod Stewart, Diana Ross. So pretty big concert. So thank you for coming today. And this is the end of our regular schedule of Brown Bag History for this season. But we'll probably have a picnic in a couple of weeks if there's nice weather, or just a little roundup for the season. So thank you for joining us today.